My parents sent me the bill for my wedding after offering to pay for it, and since they had given a large sum of money to my sister, they were shocked when I handed them the check along with a letter. I never had the best relationship with my parents, but it wasn't terrible either. They always showed a preference for my sister, Sarah, but I learned to live with it. Sarah, now 32, was always what you'd call the golden child. I, at 28, was used to living in her shadow. I grew up watching her get the latest phones, the best clothes, and all the attention, while I settled for hand-me-downs and worked since I was 16 to afford the things I wanted. I didn't complain too much. I understood my parents weren't obligated to give me anything beyond the basics. Plus, I took pride in being independent. The real surprise came when Sarah got married 3 years ago, and my parents gave her and her husband the incredible sum of €200,000 as a wedding gift, which they used to buy a beautiful house in an upscale neighborhood. At that moment, I was genuinely happy for her, though I admit it stung a little. I had my own life. I was doing well as a software engineer, had saved up a good amount of money, and was dating Tom, who would later become my husband. I thought my moment would come, and I didn't dwell on the fact that my parents had never given me anything even remotely close to what they gave Sarah. After all, I didn't expect it. A year later, Tom proposed to me. We had been together for years, and he was everything I had ever dreamed of in a partner. We planned a modest wedding, nothing too extravagant, because we wanted to save for the future. Neither of us wanted to blow all our savings on just one day, no matter how important it was. We budgeted around €36,000, which we thought was reasonable for the kind of wedding we wanted, elegant but without excess. To my surprise, my parents offered to pay for the entire wedding. I felt touched, almost overwhelmed. It felt like, for once, they were recognizing me as equally important. They seemed enthusiastic, asking about venues and vendors, and genuinely seemed interested in helping. I didn't think much about the amount. I assumed they had already done so much for Sarah that maybe they wanted to do something for me too. I never expected them to contribute anything close to what they gave Sarah, but their offer to cover the wedding seemed incredibly generous. The wedding day was perfect. We had a small, intimate ceremony with close family and friends, just as we wanted. My parents gave speeches, danced with us, and seemed genuinely happy. For the first time in a long time, I felt like they were finally treating me equally, as if they were proud of me. Tom and I planned to go on our honeymoon the following week, but first, we had some work commitments to fulfill. 2 days after the wedding, I received an email from my father. It wasn't a sweet note or a gift card, as I had imagined. Instead, it was a detailed bill, attached as a PDF, listing every expense they had paid for the wedding. The email was brief and cold. Please settle this as soon as possible. Your mother and I expect prompt payment. I stared at the screen in disbelief. The invoice totaled €34,546.89, meticulously accounting for every floral arrangement and appetizer. Tom found me sitting there, frozen, and when I showed him the email, he was furious. It wasn't about the money. We could pay it if necessary. But that wasn't the point. My parents had offered to pay for the wedding. I hadn't asked them to take on a single expense. They came to me, offered it as a gift, and even seemed excited to be part of the planning process. Even at the wedding, they presented themselves as the generous parents who had paid for their daughter's wedding. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. It wasn't just about the money. It was the result of years of being treated as less than Sarah. When she got married, they gave her €200,000 as a gift, no strings attached. They didn't ask for a single cent back, and now they were billing me for my wedding, treating it as a loan. Which wasn't the case, because they never mentioned I would have to pay it back. The next morning, after a sleepless night talking it all over with Tom, I made a decision. I sent my parents a check for the full amount, but I also sent them a letter. I didn't want to confront them directly because I knew I wouldn't be able to contain my emotions, and I didn't want it to turn into a shouting match. In the letter, I explained how hurt I felt. I reminded them that I had been independent since I was 16, paying for my things while watching them give everything to Sarah. I wrote that when they offered to pay for the wedding, I naively believed they were finally treating me with the same love and care they had always given my sister. Instead, they had betrayed me. I didn't hold back. I told them that all this time I had let things slide and had never said a word about how differently they treated Sarah and me. But what I couldn't accept was this cruel deceit. They had made me believe they were giving me a gift, only to turn around and demand payment as if I were a stranger, not their daughter. I also wrote that this would be the last financial interaction we would have. From that moment on, I would refuse any offers of help, support, or gifts from them, and I made it clear that I wanted nothing from them in the future, not even an inheritance. I told them they could give it all to Sarah, as they had done with everything else. I sent the check and the letter by mail, and I blocked their numbers. Tom supported my decision, and I felt a kind of relief after sending everything. They remained completely silent for days. Then, messages started coming from distant relatives. Aunts, uncles, and family friends began calling and sending messages, accusing me of being ungrateful and dramatic. I want to start by thanking everyone who has supported me. Although I've tried to stay strong, things continue to unfold. A few days after Sarah's visit, I received a call from my father's brother, my uncle. I hadn't spoken to him in years and honestly didn't know what to expect. He was never very close to the family, so I thought he was calling to tell me to make up with my parents, like everyone else. Instead, what he told me left me speechless and put everything into perspective in a way I hadn't seen before. He started by saying he had heard what was happening through the family and felt the need to reach out because, apparently, this wasn't the first time my parents had done something like this. Something similar had happened between him and my grandparents, my father's parents, 20 years ago. My uncle refused to go along with my grandparents' manipulative tactics, and as a result, they smeared his name throughout the family, accusing him of trying to steal from them and being ungrateful for everything they had done for him. He explained that back then, my father didn't support him. In fact, he sided with his parents, leading to a major rift between the two brothers that never fully healed. My uncle said he always felt abandoned by my father, and it took him years to accept how our family really worked. Hearing him talk about the past was like hearing my own story, but in a different context. My grandparents used money and manipulation to control my uncle, just like my parents are trying to do with me now. The more he spoke, the more everything made sense. My parents weren't acting out of character. They were repeating a pattern established long before I was born. They learned this behavior from their own parents, and my father, having been complicit in his brother's situation so many years ago, was now playing the same role with me. My uncle also mentioned that his refusal to comply with my grandparents' demands had serious consequences. After the fight, my grandparents cut him off completely, both financially and emotionally. They painted him as the black sheep of the family, and to this day, there are relatives who still believe the lies my grandparents told about him. It was all about control, he said, and when they couldn't control me anymore, they erased me from their lives just like that. Hearing my uncle's story gave me chills. It was like a reflection of what was happening to me now. My parents were upset because I had refused to play their game, and instead of trying to understand my perspective, they had turned the whole family against me. I started to see how deep this toxic cycle ran and how entrenched my parents were in the belief that they could control their children through manipulation. After my conversation with my uncle, I couldn't stop thinking about everything he had told me. It made me wonder if, deep down, my father's behavior was driven by guilt. Maybe he knew he had abandoned his brother all those years ago and was now trying to justify his actions by using the same tactics. My parents had built their relationship with Sarah and me around the idea that we owed them something, and any deviation from that script was seen as betrayal. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this wasn't about me. It was about them, their own unresolved issues, and the unhealthy dynamics they had learned from their own parents. In the days that followed, I continued to receive more messages from relatives. It became clear that Sarah had been working overtime to turn people against me. One of my cousins, with whom I had always had a good relationship, sent me a long message telling me I was being selfish and ungrateful for not appreciating everything my parents had done for me. She told me it wasn't too late to fix things, but that I needed to humble myself and apologize before it was too late. Her message was full of the same rhetoric everyone else had been using, and it was exhausting to read. I realized I had grown up in a family where love was conditional. Everything came with strings attached, whether it was financial help, emotional support, or even something as simple as celebrating a life event like a wedding. And now that I had refused to play by their rules, they were isolating me, just like they did with my uncle. Tom has been crucial through all of this. After my uncle's call, we sat down and had a long conversation about the future. He told me that no matter what happens, we will face it together and that I don't owe anything to anyone. Not to my parents, not to Sarah, and certainly not to the relatives who had suddenly become armchair psychologists. His support has been invaluable, and I am grateful beyond words. Then something strange happened. I received a voicemail from my dad from another number, probably from a relative. It was the first time he had tried to contact me directly since I sent the letter and the check. His voice sounded different. He didn't sound angry or demanding, as I had expected. Instead, he sounded tired. In the message, he said he didn't want to fight anymore and that he was willing to talk if I was open to it. He didn't apologize or acknowledge what had happened, but it was clear that something had changed. Maybe he was starting to realize that this time I wasn't going to back down. I haven't responded yet. Part of me wants to call him back and see if there is a possibility of having an honest conversation about everything. But another part of me knows this could just be another attempt to manipulate me into feeling guilty. My uncle's words echo in my head. They will never admit they are wrong because they don't believe they are. If I decide to talk to my dad, I need to be prepared for the possibility that nothing will change. I want to believe that my parents can change, that they can finally see me as an equal and not just someone they can control, but I also know that, after years of being treated this way, it will take more than one conversation to repair the damage. As much as I want a clear answer, I'm still in the same boat as always, and maybe that's okay. I'll keep you all updated as things progress, but for now, I'm just trying to navigate this as best as I can. Update 3. I want to start by saying that I appreciate all of your responses. Your advice and support have been invaluable as I try to navigate this mess with my family. When I first posted, I didn't know where everything was headed or what I wanted to do, but after reading your comments and a lot of reflection, I've come to some important realizations. Something that really stood out to me from your responses was that many of you pointed out that I had been forcing myself to try to fix things with my mom and dad, trying to patch the relationship and pretend everything was okay. But the truth is, I've finally accepted that it's okay if things don't go back to being normal, because honestly, I'm not even sure what was normal. The dynamic with my parents has always been unhealthy, and I've spent years trying to ignore it. Now I realize that it's okay to let go of the idea that things will one day be how I want them to be. Many of you also pointed out that maybe I was being too lenient in assuming my dad's behavior was driven by guilt. Looking back, I see that I was holding on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, his behavior was driven by guilt and that he could change. You were right. Guilt doesn't justify his actions or excuse the years of manipulation, favoritism, and emotional control. No matter how guilty he might feel, that doesn't erase the damage that's been done, nor does it mean I should just forgive him. At the same time, I realize that I need closure. I need to end this chapter of my life, whether that means reconciling with my parents or not. So I decided to meet with my dad. I felt like it was something I had to do to get that closure for myself, not for them. When I met with my dad, I could tell right away that he wasn't the same person I had grown up knowing. He looked exhausted, almost defeated, and for the first time in my life, he genuinely seemed remorseful. He didn't say, "I'm sorry," in those exact words, but he did apologize for how things had turned out with the wedding and for how both my mom and Sarah had treated me. He even mentioned that he had spoken to some of our relatives and asked them to stop bothering me, which was a small relief. But then he did something that took me by surprise. He tried to give me the money back. He pulled out the same check I had sent for the wedding expenses and slid it toward me, asking me to take it back. He said that he and my mom had discussed it and wanted to make things right. This time I was prepared. I told him as clearly as I could that I wasn't going to take the money back. I made it clear that this wasn't just about the money, it was about everything that had happened over the years, about how they had always treated me as second best, and the emotional impact that had on me. I explained that accepting the money back wouldn't fix that, and that this was no longer a financial transaction. I could see his frustration when I refused to take the money. It was as if he didn't know what else to offer me. I think in his mind, giving the money back was his way of saying, "I'm sorry," but that didn't address the deeper issues that had been poisoning our relationship for years. He couldn't see that the damage wasn't something that could be undone with a check. After I told him I wouldn't take the money, he was silent for a few minutes before saying that he didn't want to lose me. He said he knew things had gotten out of hand and that he didn't want our family to be destroyed. I could see he was trying to be sincere, but even then, I realized I wasn't looking for reconciliation in the way he wanted. I wasn't interested in going back to how things were or pretending everything could be okay. Suddenly, what I needed was space. A true break from the toxic dynamics that had defined our relationship for so long. So I told him I needed a break from the family, and that while this meeting had been important, it didn't change much. I explained that I wasn't ready to just forgive and forget, and that I needed time to heal on my own terms. He didn't argue with me, which surprised me. He just nodded and said he understood. He didn't try to convince me to come back or tell me I was overreacting, like he had in the past. In a way, that was more of an apology than anything else he could have said. Maybe that doesn't fix our issues, but at least it feels like some sort of closure for me. If nothing new happens with my story, then this will be my final update.